I talk about the basketball analogy of Hank Paulson, the four-corner offense. That's how the University of North Carolina used to pass the ball around and run the clock out without ever shooting. Well, that's what I think he's been up to in recent months. Methods of coping: they cut rates, they stimulate fiscal policy, they expand the discount window, they do all kinds of things that are actually spending your money in the future and your children's money more and more. Market fundamentalism has extracted a very, very substantial price. And I say in the last line there, we don't let people smoke in bed or drive drunk. We have to have rules in our society that protect us from the excesses in another corner of society. This is where the deification and deference to finance is very troublesome. We have, as I've heard in earlier speeches today, the heads I win, tails taxpayer loses system, and executive incentives certainly have to be brought under control as well. Inevitably, to clean up the credit allocation process, sometime probably in 2009, we will have a separation between the good and bad assets so that people can get back to a proper credit allocation process. And it will cost the taxpayers money. It will cost them a lot more doing it next year than this year because things will deteriorate between now and then. And here's a laundry list of reforms that might accompany this continued too big to fail system, which I do think we're stuck with. And I'm moving fast here because I want to get on to the next part. You're going to have big fights about the budget. The bailout, the cyclical losses on the downturn, continued war financing is going to bring entitlements and the tax code and everything into play. You already see Pete Peterson and other financiers circling their wagons talking about the need to do things in the out years. And there's just going to be a tremendous Donnybrook in our society. Who's going to save us with campaign contributions from Wall Street and the adverse feedback loop of them being able to protect themselves? I think Larry Lessig's speech was very timely this morning. Here's a little bit of early on in the top 20. That's what Barack had going on at the end of February. The numbers are much bigger now. And there's the Maverick. I have this horrible fantasy. I worked during the Keating Five on the Senate Banking Committee, and the idea that in the middle of this mess, we're going to hand one of the Keating Five the job of cleaning up the financial sector is just, that's almost laughable. This is a quote from a book, and I'll just go to the last line. And there's nothing more fatal for the life expectancy of the elite than to be viewed as ridiculous. Many of you who are Democrats have seen Alan Greenspan under the lens in recent times. This is an old picture of J.P. Morgan Jr. They put a midget on his lap during the Senate Banking Committee PCORA hearings and took this picture, which appeared on the front page all over the world, as people tried to render him ridiculous for the financial practices of his firm at that time. No one is scapegoated to that degree, nor is it concentrated in their power. Recently in the New York Times, Robert Rubin came under a great deal of scrutiny in an article that is very, very stressful about his role vis-a-vis Citibank, where they talked about the downturn and analysts saying, where was he? Because he's viewed kind of as the Yoda of the financial sector. He responded to an interview, and I just put 3 clips in here where he says, in essence, I don't think it was my fault. And another guy who speaks off the record says, well, he was like the Wizard of Oz, and he was the guy that made all the decisions, and the last line has to do with how much money he got paid. Now, William Greider's a good friend of mine, and he's done some extensive interviews you can find on the Nation's website with Bob Rubin, and I don't pick on him because I think he's the worst animal, but he is in a position right now, a very prestigious man, where an awful lot is at risk, and I wonder about his and other people's judgment in terms of guiding our future candidates, particularly President Obama. And I think he's an earnest man. I don't think Alan Greenspan or he or Larry Summers or anybody were trying to mess up the system. But these are there's a lot of weight on their shoulders. And when I said this at lunchtime, Alex Gibney, my good friend and filmmaker, said to me, well, Rob, you should put some more music in this thing. You should put Sympathy for the Devil as the backing track to this slide. But he's been on the dark side for too long, so I rejected that notion. I worry less about individuals than I worry about the tyranny of ideas. I see Stephen Fraser talks about the different types of people that we have, and finance kind of archetypes, and Robert Pirsig talks about the aristocratic myths and the cowboy myths that inform the things that are attractive to our society. There are some structural myths. You know, the old saying, markets are efficient. Reminds me of the two Chicago school economists who are walking down the street. One of them looks at him and says, hey, is that a $50 bill over there on the floor? And he says, no, if it was, somebody already would have picked it up. The notion that financiers are prescient or wise, I find just frightening because I've been one and hung around them, and I don't think like that. That market outcomes are impersonal and inevitable, these are human creations. That's a fallacy. Or that finance is too complex for people to understand. There's too much leverage, there's too much complexity, there's too much government assistance. It's not that complicated. The Horatio Alger myth, the right wing has used this as an elixir to attract you all. You work hard, you can be self-sufficient. Well, there are an awful lot of hard-working, well-meaning people going to get their house taken out of their hands right now because of how somebody in some other corner of the economy was playing funny. So I don't think that one's going to last very long. And the idea that the government has no role, that like the private and public sector are separate, while we're begging sovereign wealth funds all over the world to come and buy our banks and we won't nationalize them ourselves. I find that an interesting contradiction. This is Paul Krugman's chart, which I think is a pretty substantial indictment. The idea of all this deregulation and this regime has been wonderful, except that during the New Deal period, when we had compartmentalized finance, we had higher productivity growth than we've had in the subsequent period. I think that's worthy of an argument. I put this slide in for you, Jennifer, because I heard you singing it, so I just snapped it up there. But when I tried to put the Sam Cooke music in, it wouldn't work. Like I had a technical malfunction, and you know what the problem was? The problem was Sam Cooke's ghost heard how well you did that song, and he wouldn't let me put it in here. He didn't want to get embarrassed. But I think we are in a time now where we're going to have some real tension. We're going to have some real pain. These guys are still doing well because they're pretending the state's separate from the private sector. And so there's all kinds of feeding at the trough. And we've got a handful of things here that are reforms I'd be happy to talk to anybody about. Once again, Larry Lessig gets the red line. Public financing of elections would make this work a lot better. So I look at the progressive attitude towards finance that you saw the slide. Well, I pulled back the zoom lens with Alex Gibney. But I want to remind you that the guy talking right now on the stage, if you look at his resume, he's also been a financier, and he propagates myths too. In fact, Professor Doug Melton at Harvard has shown that the myth of the frog in the boiling water is not true. That if you start to raise the water temperature on the frog, he will jump out of the water. So that's nonsense. And I guess what I would say is I expect you all to jump out of the water too, because the pain and the temperature is rising really quickly. So at any rate, we'll let Glenn Ansard finish the conversation for us with a little bit of music. Yeah.